I'm Christoph Jones. This is a record show, episode 6, the last half of the top 10. Timber Timbre, self-titled album, 2009. So this is kind of like the newest band of bands that I'm kind of mildly obsessed with. I had been listening to Dead Man's Bones album a lot, and my friend Cameron was like, "Hey, you like Dead Man's Bones? You should check out Timber Timbre."
I don't like this.
I listened to Woman, I think, which is not actually on this album, but whatever. So I listened to that track, a live version. I thought, wow, these guys are rad. And ever since then, pretty much been scooping up everything they had. They had a new album come out this year, Sincerely Future Pollution. It's good, it's different. Every album is just tonally the same, but they use different instrumentation and just have a different vibe to it. So the new album's kind of 80s, influence sounding, at least to my ears. And this is kind of more stripped back, which fantastic too. But I pretty much listen to them nonstop every morning a few years ago, so I was quite depressed. Next on the list, we've got Velvet Underground and Nico, the Andy Warhol album. Classic. I mean, is there a bad song on this album at all? No, I just checked. There's not a bad song on this album at all. I got something to say. This album's really good. Introduced me to punk rock. I've told that story, I think, the first episode. If you want to know more about what kind of an impact this Misfits Collection 2 had on me, go back to that first episode and you will know it. The first songs I remember listening to were We Are 138 and Attitude. I was like, what? This? Link Wray. This is self-titled 1979 album. I did not know about this album for a really, really long time. I was definitely late to the Link Wray game, which whatever. We're all late to something. I mean, it's just life. But anyway, I was at a record collecting show in Birmingham, Alabama, which is where I lived at the time. And the dude was at his booth that I bought this from, and he was, how it is though, I'll ask you like, hey man, are you looking for anything particular? And I was going through a really big Link Wray kick, and I said, hey, what Link Wray stuff do you have? I was kind of looking for 7 inches, but whatever. He said, well, I've got this one, and he pulled this out, and I was like, huh? This is not pompadour ponytail Link Wray that I'm used to, just from the album cutout, which, what a cool deal. I mean, I love weird album thing. I hate putting the record in the sleeve because it's such a pain in the butt, but the cutout itself is pretty rad. Anyway, so he was like, dude, if you haven't heard this album, you should check it out. I've got an original press. I took it home, listened to it immediately. It's immediately became one of my top albums from when I got it a few years ago. So yeah, super great. Recently, a repress of this was done, and I have it to Light in the Attic, put that out, I believe. All right, man. Last on the list, this is Neil Young live at Massey Hall, 1971. I like Neil Young a lot. Everybody should. In particular, this album means a lot to me. I was really starting to get into records a little bit more, and I work with this guy named Steve. And Steve was the first person that I personally knew that had an amazing stereo. Like, it was amazing. Macintosh stuff, Altec Lansing, I like all the hits, like the goods. And he was just this older hippie guy. We just started talking about records, and I mean, he hooked me up with my first real record player, one that I just didn't scavenge from someplace or get like fourth hand at a junk store or whatever. And I remember the first time we came over, or I came over to his house. he was really pumped because they had just released this, and we sit down and we listen to it. And Steve had this amazing setup. He had his two gigantic Altec Lansing speakers, perfectly spaced for this one area in his listening room. And he had a single chair, records everywhere, and his stack kind of right in front of him. And then he had his chair. And I remember we sat there, and Steve smoked cigarettes like a freight train, and he turned off all the lights in the room, and so the only thing that was producing light were the amps in the stereo and his constant cigarette smoking. And he let me sit in the chair, and I got it then what a real stereo should sound like. Record collecting became way less of a novelty at that point to me. And this was a good 10, 12 years ago. And I had been collecting at that point for like 3 or 4 years or whatever, but I didn't take it that seriously. But then when I listened to Live at Massey Hall, I was there, 100% there. When in the kind of in-between tracks, when Neil Young's like speaking to the crowd or making wisecracks about the photographer guy throwing his timing off, in that dark room filled with cigarette smoke, hearing a stereo that made me physically feel the music, I was transported back to 1971, and I was at that show from listening to this record. And I think since then, that's when I was like, okay, I got to get a real stereo. And so slowly but surely, I've been kind of working on that. And this album, as far as a live album, I've listened to hundreds of times. And I sit back and listen to this album now, and I'm transported, not as much to Massey Hall, but I am to that time sitting there with Steve. And we would do that for hours. And I remember my lady friend at the time would always be like, what are you guys sitting around doing drugs? And I'm just like, no, we're listening to records. We're sitting there, we're talking about the records. It was transformative for sure for me. And then, I remember we also listened to some of his favorites, and he would tell me stories. And it was just awesome. And I think that further cemented another way to love music.